The Memory of Love, Chapter 26. My first reaction upon my release was to rid myself of the odors of that vile place. I showered twice, then shaved. Later, I called and arranged to see Safia. She was thinner, the skin beneath her eyes puffy and darkened. Strands of hair had loosened from her braids. She embraced me, and for a few seconds, she remained with her forehead pressed against my shoulder. I became overwhelmingly conscious of her physical presence. Her relief, of course, lay in knowing where Julius was being held, if not the exact reason why. In the account I gave of my own time in custody, I omitted mention of the visit to me by the dean. I'm not sure why. I suppose I felt it would complicate matters unnecessarily. First thing Monday, Safia visited the building where Johnson worked. She telephoned me later. Johnson, with his usual obtuseness, had kept her waiting for 2 hours, then sent down a number of forms for her to complete. She'd had no option but to oblige. When she returned the promise to process them, it might take a few days. In a few days, I could hear in her voice how close she was to tears. "Shall I come over?" I asked. She said she was going to bed. Meanwhile, I was having my own troubles. Earlier that day, as I went to buy bread, I noticed a man standing in the street. I would have thought nothing of it, only later, emerging from the bakery, I saw him again, on the opposite side of the street. I eased my pace, just to see what happened. I noted he let a vacant taxi pass him by. He was still there when I reached my door. Later, I checked the street. No sign of him. Instead, there was another man standing at the cigarette kiosk. He had his back to me, but as he turned, I was certain I caught him glancing up at my window. All through the oppressive day, I stayed in my apartment, seeking solace and distraction among my papers, but to read was impossible. Instead, I smoked and paced, twitching, moving an object here or there. You'd think that after 2 sleeping nights, I would be exhausted, and I was, exhausted and yet incapable of rest. Outside my window, the sound of a workman's hammer played on my nerves. In an effort to rein control and try to put my thoughts in some sort of order, I wrote down everything that had happened. It helped, as it often did, to see it in black and white on the page. I went to bed late, slept erratically, and woke determined not to endure another day like the one before. I left the house and hailed a passing poda. As we drew away, I watched from the window for a sign of anything suspicious. I switched vehicle twice during my journey and arrived at the university mid-morning. Nothing unusual, either on campus. It was my luck this whole episode had taken place during the holidays. Today was Tuesday. Friday, the day of my arrest, was always a slow day. It was likely few people had missed me. I made my way up to my office. Checking my pigeonhole on the way, saw 2 of my colleagues and exchanged greetings. I reached my room and closed the door behind me. Remained leaning against it for a moment or 2. I looked around. Somebody had been in my room. Several items had been moved. Vitally, my typewriter was missing. I looked through cupboards and opened drawers. The typewriter was nowhere to be seen. It became apparent my room had been searched. The typewriter removed as some sort of evidence. I walked down the corridor to the dean's office. The dean was facing the window. He stood with his legs apart, hands behind his head. He did not turn his head or acknowledge my presence. Yet I had the sense, in that still figure at the window, of a tremendous alertness. He turned around to face me. Good to see you, Cole. How are you? I replied I was well. Excellent, he said. I just came by to thank you for your help last week. He waved my words away and said, Bad. These sorts of matters, no good for anyone. Yes, I said. I was wondering. I hesitated and then continued. Is there any news of Dr. Kamara? His wife is very worried. Dr. Kamara, I wondered if you had any information, if perhaps you could use your good offices with Mr. Johnson to inquire. But the dean was already shaking his head. I barely know Mr. Johnson. I tried again. I'd like to be able to reassure his wife. The warmth had left his face entirely. He moved to sit down behind his desk and began to straighten some of the piles of paper upon it. When he spoke, his voice contained a slight but significant change of tone. My advice to you is to leave this matter alone. If you are not involved, as you maintain, the point of authority is not to question it. That is why I have come to you, to see if there's anything you can do. We have been through difficult times, said the dean, with some irritation, and nobody in this country wants a return to the problems of the past. The police have a job to do. Once trouble begins, it has a habit of spreading. Now it's the universities. Look at Europe. Students burning down their own libraries, taking to the streets, disobeying the law. Now the disease has come over here. Ibadan, Nairobi, Accra. The students are no longer interested in learning. They've turned into hooligans. I have no intention of allowing this university to go the same way. As he spoke, his gaze rested upon me. He was entirely still. His eyes reflected the light from the window. Just before his eyelids dropped down over his eyes, I saw the depth of the ambition in them. I had the unerring sense the discussion was at an end. I rose to go. One moment. He fetched something from the cupboard behind his desk. I saw it was my typewriter. He said, unauthorized use of university property. It may seem unimportant to you, but then you do not have my job. Once you let something slide, it is just the beginning. He handed it to me. In this case, though, I am willing to accept it was an honest mistake. Thank you, I said. Just as I reached the door, he said my name, Cole. My hand was on the doorknob. I turned. He was standing reading a document. He looked up fleetingly. Be careful of the company you keep, Cole. Kekura, as it turned out, had escaped arrest. He had spent the night with a woman friend, and stopping by Yansane's house early in the day, had got wind of the arrest. He decided to visit some friends who happened to live over the border until he deemed it safe to return. Safia told me this on Wednesday when we met over coffee at the Red Rooster. She'd been busy pursuing her own lines of inquiry. Her face was serious, resolved. Delicate lines on the sides of her eyes I had never noticed before. Other lines of determination either side of her mouth. They did nothing to diminish her beauty. She seemed to have regained her poise. The news of Kekura delivered by a friend, the dancer apparently. For some reason, it grated upon me that he should have played a part in the restoration of her confidence. I wondered about him. I wondered about Kekura too. A waitress brought Nescafe in stainless steel pots, a small jug of evaporated milk, a bowl of sugar, cubes, and set them down without ceremony upon the checkered plastic cloth. So what's next? I said. She had been back to see Johnson each day, while he refused to officially verify Julius was in his custody. Everything in his manner confirmed it to her. He had told her to go home and wait. Perhaps you should You look exhausted. She looked up at me. Her eyes flashed. What are you saying, Elias? Only that some things are best left. If you rile them, you might end up making things worse for Julius. She looked at me steadily. I know you were just trying to help. She drew a deep breath. I've been to see a lawyer, she announced. The lawyer says to give Johnson 2 more days and then to issue a writ of habeas corpus, one for Julius, one for Ade. I listened. I said, I want Julius out of there as much as you do. Believe me, only if you do as you suggest, you risk bringing the whole thing out into the open. That's the point. The trouble is, I said gently, you'd end up putting Johnson on the defensive. He might have to justify himself by charging Julius, and that would be a worse outcome. What would you suggest? She asked. That we continue as we are. Do as Johnson says and wait. He can't keep Julius in there forever. He just wants to show he's a big man. Perhaps I can speak to my pastor, see if he can bring any pressure to bear. She sipped her coffee. Thoughts shadowed her face. Finally, she said, it's not just that I can't sit and do nothing. It's that I won't. This isn't just about Julius. Don't you see, Elias? This is about all of us. To tolerate this kind of thing, well, it would be just the beginning. Just the beginning. The second time inside the day, somebody had said those words. 10 minutes later, I watched her wind her orange scarf around her head and walk away from me. She declined my offer to accompany her home. She wasn't sure yet where she was going, whether back to Johnson or to the lawyer's office. She had a few errands to run in the meanwhile. Call me if you hear anything. Of course, Elias. As it turned out, events outpaced the lawyer's interventions. The writ of habeas corpus was drawn up on Thursday. Before it could be delivered, Yanase was released. In the light of this new development, the lawyer suggested they hold off to see what happened next. Julius's release might be imminent. Later in the same day, Safia and I went to Yanase's place. He seemed, how can I describe it to you, somehow slowed, even more so than before. His short brow furrowed beneath the straight hairline. There was an air of bewilderment about him. I held back and watched Safia embrace him. Couldn't help but measure the embrace for warmth and tenderness. But Yanase just stood, his arms by his sides. Afterwards, he turned and walked to the seat, where he sat down heavily and shook his head. For some minutes, the three of us remained bound together in silence. Yanase asked if there was news of Julius. No, Safia replied. Shoulders bowed, eyes cast down. He seemed smaller, somehow. I expected Yanase, the good-natured pedant, to be more stoical. You will imagine we questioned him about his experience, that we dug around for facts to piece together, that we examined the thing this way and that to find answers. It wasn't like that. We listened as he recounted in a low voice those relevant parts of his ordeal. He spoke at his own pace, the sentences punctuated by long silences. He had been questioned as I had been. The questions pursued more or less the same line. They seemed to be looking for agitators on the campus. Julius, his views, his movements, the company he kept. Yanase mentioned meetings in my room, though in the flow of his account they did not emerge as especially significant. None of what he said added much to what we already knew. We left Yanase's place and drove back through the town. It was only evening. Safia's fingers played upon the steering wheel. She said, one never expects to find oneself in this kind of situation. It's the sort of thing you read about. That happens to other people in other countries. I made no reply. A few years ago, we'd had a coup, our first, followed by 2 years of military rule. Not what you hope for, but still, it had all seemed to take place at a different level, well above the lives of ordinary people. We'd woken up one morning to a new government, and in many ways, the military were not the worst you could imagine. Though few people publicly supported them, quite a few did so privately. Now we had a civilian government again. In a building in this city, in a room or a cell, is my husband. I can't see him. I can't find my way to him. Yet I know he is there, and so do the people who put him there. Whatever the outcome, even if Julius is released tomorrow, things will never be the same again. This is something more, don't you see? I shook my head. Let's not blow things out of proportion. You don't know Johnson like I do. I was with the man for the best part of 2 days. He's the one who's behind this. There's no great conspiracy. Johnson's got ahead of himself, that's all. Nothing more to it than that. But he's not all powerful. To take things further, he'll have to consult someone higher up and they'll put a stop to it. She looked at me. I could see the hope in her eyes. Do you think so, Elias? She wanted to believe. Yes, I said. Family, I do.